There was a time when a mother's love was the one thing nobody could ever take away. But what happened to Denise Coleman on Family Feud would make you believe in miracles again. When Steve Harvey found out the truth about her missing son, he did something that left the entire studio in tears, something nobody in that building would ever forget. Denise Coleman was 47 years old. For 14 years, she had gone to bed every single night wondering where her son was sleeping, what he looked like now, whether he was happy, whether he even remembered her voice. Denise grew up in Flint, Michigan, the oldest of 5 kids raised by a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to keep food on the table. Money was always tight. Some winters, the heat got shut off, and Denise remembered wrapping her younger siblings in every blanket in the house just to keep them warm until morning. She learned early that love meant sacrifice. She learned to braid her sister's hair before school, to stretch a single box of pasta into 3 separate meals, and to never complain, because complaining didn't pay the light bill, and it didn't put food on the table either. Her mother used to tell her, "Denise, you were born responsible. Some people have to learn it. You came out already knowing it." Denise carried that responsibility like a badge her whole life, even when it became too heavy to hold. When Denise was 24, she had her son, Marcus. She named him after her own father, a man she barely remembered but always heard stories about. A man who worked with his hands, fixed things for the whole neighborhood for free, and never once raised his voice at his children. Denise wanted her son to grow up with that same steady, gentle strength, even if the world around them was anything but steady. Marcus had his mother's eyes and a laugh that could fill up a whole room. Even as a baby, he laughed easily. At everything, at nothing at all. Denise used to say he laughed like he already knew, somewhere deep down, that life was going to be good to him. She used to rock him to sleep singing old church hymns. Her own mother used to hum, songs about mercy and grace, songs she didn't fully understand the weight of until years later. Those first 3 years were hard in every practical way. Long shifts, unreliable childcare, a relationship with Marcus's father that was already falling apart. But they were also, in Denise's memory, some of the sweetest years of her whole life. She remembered Marcus's chubby hands gripping her fingers on his first unsteady walk across the living room. She remembered him falling asleep on her chest during thunderstorms, convinced that as long as he could hear her heartbeat, nothing bad could reach him. But life had other plans for Denise Coleman, and they were cruel ones. When Marcus was 3 years old, Denise was arrested. It wasn't for anything violent. It was a string of bad decisions made by a young, exhausted, broke single mother trying to keep her head above water. A stolen credit card here, a bounced check scheme there, run mostly by a boyfriend who disappeared the second the police started asking questions. Denise took the fall because she didn't fully understand what she was signing when she agreed to a plea deal, and because she didn't have the money for a lawyer who might have explained it better. She was sentenced to 8 years in a state facility, 3 hours away from home. The day she was taken away, Marcus was at his grandmother's house, unaware that the woman who tucked him in every night wasn't coming back for a very long time. Denise remembered the last thing she said to him before that morning, not even realizing it would be the last thing she'd say to him as a free woman for years to come. "Be good for Grandma, baby. Mama loves you to the moon." Because Marcus's father was largely absent and unreliable, custody eventually passed to his paternal grandmother and aunt in Georgia. Denise fought this from behind bars as hard as any incarcerated person could, filing what paperwork she could, requesting visitation, calling collect from a payphone every chance she got. But the system was not built for women in her position, and the family in Georgia was not eager to make room for her voice in Marcus's life. Denise wrote him letters every single week from prison, every Sunday, without fail, rain or shine, good week or terrible week. She sat down with a pencil and a piece of lined paper and wrote to her son as if he could already read, describing the weather outside her small barred window, telling him about a bird that had built a nest nearby, promising him that one day they would be together again and it would be better than anything either of them could imagine. She drew little pictures on the envelopes. Suns, flowers, sometimes a crooked heart, hoping that even if he couldn't read the words yet, he could feel that his mother was thinking about him. She counted down his birthdays on a paper calendar taped inside her cell, crossing off days with a stub of pencil sharpened down to almost nothing. 4, 5, 6 years old. She marked each one, imagining what kind of cake he might be having, what kind of toys he might like now, whether he'd lost his first tooth yet. But somewhere around Marcus's 6th birthday, the letters stopped coming back. Not because Denise stopped writing. She never stopped. Not once. Not for the rest of her sentence. But because Marcus's father's family moved, and then moved again, and eventually stopped responding to any of Denise's outreach altogether. Her letters were returned unopened, stamped not at this address, or simply never answered at all. Denise did not know it then, but somewhere in Georgia, a young boy was also wondering, every single day, why the letters had stopped, not understanding that they hadn't stopped at all. They simply weren't being given to him. By the time Denise was released, 7 years later, on good behavior, after serving the majority of her sentence, Marcus was 10 years old. She searched every way she knew how, with almost nothing to her name. She hired a private investigator using money she scraped together from 3 different part-time jobs, money she desperately needed for rent and food, but she paid it anyway because finding her son mattered more than anything else in her life. She called children's services in 2 different states. She called old school districts, old churches, distant relatives she barely remembered. Every road led to a dead end, or worse, to silence. By the time she had enough information to know roughly which county Marcus's family had settled in, the family had moved yet again, this time without leaving so much as a forwarding address. Legally, with a felony record and no custody rights ever formally granted back to her, there was very little Denise could do to force the issue through the courts, and she couldn't afford an attorney who specialized in interstate custody battles. Every lawyer she consulted for a free 30-minute session told her some version of the same thing. This would take years, and there were no guarantees, and it would cost more money than she would ever have. Denise rebuilt her life anyway, piece by piece. The way people do when giving up is simply not an option. They allow themselves to consider. She got a job at a hospital cafeteria washing dishes and serving trays. And over the years, she worked her way up, taking night classes in nutrition, eventually becoming a nutrition assistant, helping plan meals for patients with diabetes and heart conditions. She was good at her job. She was known around the hospital as the woman who remembered everyone's name, who slipped an extra roll onto the tray of the elderly patient in room 214 who never had visitors, who always had a kind word for the exhausted nurses working double shifts. She never remarried. She never had another child. Something in her felt that having another baby, while Marcus was still out there somewhere without her, would be a kind of betrayal she couldn't live with. She kept one photo of 3-year-old Marcus in her wallet, so worn and soft at the edges from being taken out and looked at that it had lost its glossy shine entirely. The colors slightly faded, but his smile still perfectly clear. Every single year, on Marcus's birthday, Denise baked a cake. Chocolate with vanilla frosting, the only flavor he'd ever really eaten as a toddler. And she sat alone at her small kitchen table, with one lit candle, just to feel close to him, for 5 quiet minutes. She would close her eyes and try to imagine what 19 looked like on him, then 20, then 25, updating the picture in her mind each year, even though she had no photographs to base it on. She always made the same wish, out loud, every single year. Let him be safe. Let him be happy. And please, God, let him know I never stopped looking. What Denise didn't know, couldn't have known, was that somewhere out there, a young man who was once a laughing 3-year-old boy had also never stopped thinking about his mother, not for a single day of his life. Denise's co-worker at the hospital, a woman named Angela, who had become one of her closest friends over the past 6 years, was the one who convinced her to apply for Family Feud. Angela's cousin had been on the show years earlier and never stopped talking about what a wonderful, joyful experience it had been. And Angela thought Denise, of all people, deserved one good, carefree day. Denise almost said no. She said no 5 separate times. Actually, over the course of several weeks, she didn't think she deserved to be on television, laughing and playing games when somewhere out there her son might not even remember what her face looked like. She told Angela it felt wrong, almost disrespectful to the ache she carried, to go on national television and act like everything was fine. But Angela pushed back, gently but firmly, the way only a true friend can. "Denise," she said one evening as they were closing up the cafeteria kitchen together, "you have spent 14 years shrinking yourself down so your grief wouldn't take up space in this world. You go to work, you come home, you bake that cake every year, and you carry this alone. Just come, have one good day. You don't owe your pain constant attention. You're allowed one good day." Something about the way Angela said it broke through. Denise agreed, mostly because she was too tired to keep arguing, and partly because some small, stubborn part of her still believed in good things happening, even after everything. So Denise applied, and to her surprise, she was accepted. She got placed on a team with 3 other women from the hospital, all co-workers who had become like family to her over the years. Angela, a nurse named Priscilla, and a young dietary aide named Kim, who reminded Denise a little of herself at that age, hopeful and hardworking despite a difficult start in life. During the pre-show interviews, a young producer named Jasmine sat down with Denise in a small backstage room and asked her, gently, to share a little about her life for the show's background segments. Denise almost deflected the question with something light and easy, the way she usually did with strangers. But something about the quiet, patient way Jasmine asked made her open up in a way she hadn't with anyone outside her closest circle in years. She told Jasmine about Marcus, about the 8 years behind bars, about the letters she wrote every single week that eventually came back unopened, about the private investigator she couldn't really afford, about the birthday cakes made for a boy who wasn't there to eat them. Jasmine's eyes filled with tears as she listened, and at one point, she had to excuse herself for a moment to collect herself before continuing the interview. She didn't say much when she came back. She simply reached across the small table, squeezed Denise's hand, and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that story. I promise it matters." Denise didn't think much of it afterward. She assumed, if it was used at all, it would end up as a brief 15-second clip buried somewhere in the episode, a small human interest moment, before the game got underway. She had no idea that Jasmine had gone straight to the show's research department the moment the interview ended, unable to shake the story from her mind. The day of the taping finally arrived. The studio was bright and loud, full of the kind of nervous, excited energy that fills a room before a game show begins. Denise's team made it through the first 2 rounds smoothly, laughing, hugging each other after every correct answer, high-fiving like they had known each other their entire lives, instead of just a handful of years working the same hospital shifts. For those first 20 minutes, Denise felt lighter than she had in years, maybe longer. For a few precious minutes, she wasn't a woman with a permanent hole in her heart. She was simply a woman having a wonderful, silly, joyful time on a game show, and it felt like a gift. Then, during a commercial break between rounds, something unusual happened. Steve Harvey walked over to Denise's side of the stage personally, which almost never occurs during a taping break. He crouched down beside her chair, took both of her hands gently in his, and said quietly, so only she could hear, "Denise, I need you to trust me for the next few minutes. Can you do that for me?" Denise's stomach dropped instantly. Her mind raced through a dozen possibilities, none of them good. She thought maybe she had done something wrong during the game. She thought maybe production was about to send her team home early for some rules violation she wasn't aware of. She nodded anyway, confused and suddenly anxious, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. Steve stood back up, straightened his jacket with his usual calm confidence, and gave a small nod toward the control booth. The cameras rolled again, and the studio lights brightened back to full intensity. "Denise," Steve said, and immediately something in his voice had changed. The playful, joking energy of the game show host was gone, replaced by something far more serious, far more careful. "Before we move on to the next round, I want to talk about something. Our research team did some digging this week, after your pre-show interview. And there's something we need to show you today. Denise's hands began to tremble in her lap. The audience, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, went completely and utterly silent. 400 people holding their breath at once, waiting to understand what was happening. 14 years ago, Steve continued, his voice steady but gentle. You were separated from your son, Marcus. You wrote him letters every single week for years, even after they started coming back unopened. You never stopped looking for him. Not once. Even when the whole world around you told you it was hopeless, that you should just accept it and move forward. Denise pressed a shaking hand over her mouth. Tears were already falling freely down her cheeks, ruining what little makeup she'd worn that day. Denise? Steve said, kneeling down in front of her chair once more, taking her free hand in both of his. Our researchers found him. The audience gasped as one collective sound, a wave of shock rippling through the studio. Denise shook her head slowly back and forth, as if her whole body was refusing to let the words land, as if believing them too quickly might somehow make them untrue. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible even with the microphone. No, please. Please don't play with me like that. Please, Mr. Harvey, I'm asking you, please don't play with me. Steve's own eyes were glassy now, his composure clearly cracking at the edges. Denise, look at me, he said. I would never, ever play with you about something like this. Not in a million years. Not about this. Denise's co-workers around her were already crying openly, holding onto her arms and shoulders as if they were afraid she might collapse right out of her chair. The entire studio had gone completely still, an unnatural silence for a room usually filled with buzzers and laughter and applause. Marcus is 19 years old now, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. He was no longer bothering to hide. He's currently studying to become a licensed electrician. He works part-time at an auto repair shop to help pay for his training. And Denise, listen to me closely, because this is important. He never stopped looking for you either. Denise let out a sound that wasn't quite a word at all, something caught between a sob and a gasp, the sound of 14 years of silence finally cracking wide open all at once, right there in front of hundreds of strangers and millions of future viewers. He wrote you letters, too, Steve continued. Ones that never made it to you, because of circumstances beyond either of your control. He kept every single one of them, hoping that someday, somehow, some way, he'd get the chance to hand them to you himself. Steve turned his body slightly toward the side curtain of the stage. Denise, I'm going to need you to stand up now, if you can. Denise could barely feel her own legs beneath her. Her co-workers helped her rise from the chair, one hand carefully placed under each arm, as though she might shatter if they let go too quickly, as if she were made of something far more fragile than flesh and bone. Marcus? Steve called out toward the curtain, his voice carrying across the entire studio. Come on out here, son. The curtain at the side of the stage parted slowly, and a tall young man stepped through it, wearing a plain gray hoodie and jeans, his hands visibly trembling at his sides, his eyes already wet with tears. He wasn't trying to hold back. He looked so much like the man captured in Denise's old, soft, faded photograph. The very same eyes, the same set of the jaw, everything grown up and matured now. But unmistakably, undeniably, her son. Denise's knees buckled beneath her the moment she saw him. She didn't run toward him. She couldn't. 14 years of accumulated grief had turned her legs to something like stone, rooted in place by the sheer weight of the moment. It was Marcus who ran to her instead, closing the distance between them in just a handful of long, urgent strides, wrapping his arms tightly around his mother for the very first time since he was 3 years old. Mama, he said, his voice breaking apart entirely on that single, simple word. Mama, I never stopped looking for you. Not for one single day. Denise sobbed openly into his shoulder, gripping the fabric of the back of his hoodie with both fists, as though she were afraid the entire moment might vanish into thin air the second she loosened her grip. I wrote you every single week, she cried, her words tumbling out fast and broken between sobs. Every week, baby. For years. I never missed one. Not one. I know, Marcus said, pulling back just far enough to look directly into her eyes. I have every letter you ever sent me. Mama, I kept them all in a shoebox under my bed my whole life. I used to read them over and over whenever I missed you the most, even the ones I couldn't fully understand when I was little. The entire studio was in tears at this point. Audience members reaching for tissues, camera operators visibly wiping their own eyes between shots. Steve Harvey himself had to turn away from the pair for just a moment, wiping at his face with the back of his hand, his usual polished composure completely and openly gone. In all my years hosting this show, Steve said once he'd composed himself enough to speak, his voice still thick. I have seen a whole lot of things happen on this stage. I have seen people win fortunes. I have seen people lose everything on a bad guess. But I have never, in all these years, seen anything quite like what I am looking at right now. Marcus pulled back just slightly, cupping his mother's face gently in both of his hands, the exact way a person does when they are trying desperately to memorize every single detail of something they are terrified of losing all over again. You look just like I remembered you, he said softly. I was so scared, Mama, so scared that I would forget your face over the years. But I never did. Not once. How did you find him? Denise finally managed to ask, turning toward Steve, still holding onto her son with both hands, as though letting go for even a second might undo everything. Your interview reached our research and outreach team earlier this week, Steve explained, gesturing toward the young producer, Jasmine, who was now standing just off to the side of the stage, crying just as hard as everyone else. And it turned out Marcus had been searching for you too, on his end, all along. Posting on family reunion forums online, reaching out to distant relatives, anyone at all who might have information about where his birth mother might be. Our team found one of his posts just 3 days ago. We called him ourselves that very same afternoon. He was on a plane heading here by that same night. I didn't believe it at first either, Marcus admitted, laughing through his own tears now, a sound of pure relief. I genuinely thought it might be some kind of scam call when they first reached out. I almost hung the phone up on them twice before they convinced me it was real. The audience laughed through their own tears at that small detail, a welcome release of all the tension that had built steadily in the room over the past several minutes. Steve placed one hand gently on each of their shoulders, standing between them like a man officiating something far more sacred than a game show segment. Denise, he said, you spent 14 long years believing, somewhere deep down, that maybe love wasn't enough on its own to bring him back to you. But look at him, standing right here in front of you. He never let go of you either, not for a single day of his life. That right there is not luck. That is not some coincidence dressed up as fate. That is what real love looks like when it simply refuses to quit, no matter how much time or distance stands in its way. Denise did not finish the game that day. Nobody remaining in that studio cared about points or fast money or prizes anymore, least of all Denise herself. Production quietly awarded her team a portion of the day's winnings anyway as a gesture of goodwill. But as Denise said later, reflecting on the moment, I didn't even remember there was a game happening anymore. I completely forgot the cameras were even there. All I could see was my son. Steve made a special announcement to the studio audience before the show cut to a commercial break. This family is not simply going to leave this stage today and go their separate ways like nothing happened, he said firmly. We are going to make absolutely sure that Denise and Marcus get real, meaningful time together. This week, and for as long as they need, going forward. True to his word, the show's production team arranged for Marcus to stay in the city for 2 full weeks following the taping, giving mother and son the space and time to begin rebuilding what 14 stolen years had taken from them. Marcus met Denise's co-workers properly during that time, the women who had become like sisters to her over the difficult years of searching and waiting. He sat at Angela's kitchen table for a family dinner and listened, wide-eyed, as the women told him stories about his mother's quiet strength, about the birthday cake she baked every single year for a son who wasn't there to blow out the candle. Denise, in turn, made the drive down to Georgia the following month to properly meet the family who had raised her son during those lost years. not with anger simmering beneath the surface, though she certainly had every right to feel some, but with something closer to a complicated, hard-won gratitude, because whatever painful mistakes had been made along the way by the adults involved, they had ultimately raised Marcus into a good, honest, hard-working young man who still believed, against all odds, in the idea of coming home. Marcus brought the shoebox of letters with him during one of his very first visits to Denise's small apartment. They sat together on her modest living room couch for hours that evening, reading the letters out loud to each other, one by one. Some of them written in a child's careful, uneven crayon handwriting from before he could fully read on his own. Others written later, during his early teenage years, by a boy trying desperately to make sense of an absence he never fully understood the reasons behind. Denise read her own letters back to him as well, the ones she had written from behind prison walls all those years ago. The paper still creased and soft from being folded and unfolded what must have been hundreds of times over the years while she waited for an address that would take them. There were tears during that evening, plenty of them. But there was also real laughter. Marcus gently teasing his mother about a lopsided drawing of a dinosaur she had once mailed him for his 6th birthday. A drawing, he said, through a wide smile, that he still remembered taping proudly to the wall of his childhood bedroom. Denise's private birthday tradition changed forever after that reunion. The following year, on Marcus's 20th birthday, she did not sit alone at her small kitchen table with a single lit candle for company. Marcus sat directly across from her instead, and together, for the very first time in 17 years, they blew out the candle together, making the exact same wish out loud, at the exact same moment, that they would never, ever lose each other again. Marcus eventually completed his electrician training program and landed a full-time position with a respected local company. He made the decision to relocate closer to his mother permanently, renting a small apartment just 15 minutes away from hers. He began coming over for dinner most Sundays, a standing tradition neither of them ever wanted to miss. Denise slowly began teaching him some of her own mother's old recipes, the very same ones that had once stretched an impossibly thin grocery budget to feed 5 children, now prepared with love instead of desperate necessity, in a warm kitchen instead of a cold one. Word of Denise and Marcus's remarkable reunion spread far beyond the walls of the Family Feud studio almost immediately after the episode aired. Viewers wrote in by the thousands in the weeks that followed, sharing their own painful stories of family members lost to incarceration, addiction, sudden distance, or simple painful silence. Several other families later credited Denise and Marcus's story with giving them the courage to finally begin their own long-postponed searches for lost relatives. A local nonprofit organization dedicated to helping reconnect incarcerated parents with their children reached out to Denise directly within the month, and she now volunteers there faithfully once a month, sitting patiently with mothers who are still living through the hardest, most uncertain part of the very story she once lived herself. The agonizing part where you simply do not know if you will ever see your child's face again. I tell them the exact same thing every single time I sit down with them. Denise often says now, I tell them, don't ever stop writing the letters, even when it feels completely pointless, even when nobody ever writes back. Because somewhere out there, that person you love might be keeping every single one of them, waiting for the day they finally get to hand them back to you. Steve Harvey himself has spoken publicly about the reunion more than once since the original episode aired, referencing it during interviews on his own talk show and calling it one of the single most powerful moments he has personally witnessed in his many decades on television. People assume this show is only about jokes and fast money and family competition, he has said. But every now and then, without any warning at all, it becomes about something so much bigger than any of that. It becomes about giving people back entire pieces of their lives that they had long ago given up hope of ever recovering. A full year after the original reunion aired, Denise and Marcus returned together to the Family Feud studio, this time simply as invited guests, there to share a heartfelt update with the very same audience who had cried alongside them exactly 1 year earlier. Marcus stood proudly next to his mother on that familiar stage, noticeably taller now, somehow more settled and confident in himself, his steady hand resting gently on her shoulder throughout the entire segment. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry about all the years we lost together, Marcus said during that follow-up appearance. His voice calm and thoughtful. And honestly, I used to be. For a long time, I carried a lot of anger about it, more than I probably let on to anyone. But now I mostly just think about how many other people out there don't ever get an ending like this one. I got my mother back. Not everybody does. So these days, I choose to feel grateful instead of angry every single day that I wake up and get to call her. Denise, holding her son's hand tightly throughout the entire conversation, added her own reflections for the cameras and for the millions of viewers watching at home. For 14 years, I genuinely believed that love simply wasn't enough on its own, she said. I thought that if you loved somebody hard enough, deeply enough, it should have brought them back to you sooner than it did. But now I understand something different. Love doesn't operate on our timeline. It works on its own schedule, in its own time. And if you just hold on tight enough and refuse to ever fully let go, sometimes it finds its way back to you exactly when you need it the very most. Steve Harvey, standing beside the reunited mother and son one final time, looked out at his studio audience with visible emotion still lingering in his expression. That right there is the real lesson in all of this, he told the crowd. Not that everything simply works itself out easily in the end. It doesn't. Not always. And certainly not without real pain along the way. 14 years is an incredibly long time to carry that kind of hurt around with you. But this story proves something absolutely worth remembering for every single person watching at home tonight. That love, real and true love, does not simply expire with time. It waits patiently. And sometimes, if you are patient enough yourself, and you never once stop believing, it comes walking right back through the curtain, exactly when you need it the most. The studio audience rose together in a full standing ovation at those final words. But Denise and Marcus barely even seemed to notice the applause surrounding them. They were far too busy simply holding on to each other tightly, the exact way they always should have been able to for the past 14 stolen years, quietly making up now for all the time that circumstance and hardship had once taken away from them both. In the months that followed that emotional follow-up appearance, Denise and Marcus's story continued to ripple outward in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated. A local news station in their home city did a full feature segment on their reunion, which led to Denise being invited to speak at a community center about resilience and the power of never giving up hope, even in the face of a broken system that so often works against families like hers. She spoke haltingly at first, unused to public speaking of any kind, but found her voice grew stronger with each sentence, especially when she looked out and saw other mothers in the audience nodding along, some of them crying quietly in their seats, recognizing pieces of their own stories reflected back at them. Marcus, for his part, began mentoring younger apprentices at his electrician job, several of whom had grown up in foster care or unstable family situations, not entirely unlike his own childhood circumstances. He never made a big show of sharing his personal story with them, but when the moment felt right, he would quietly mention his mother and how important it had been for him to hold on to hope, even during the years when he had no concrete reason to believe reunion was possible. Every year now, on the anniversary of that original taping, Denise and Marcus make a quiet tradition of visiting the studio parking lot together. Just the two of them, sitting in Marcus's car for a few minutes before driving off to dinner, simply to remember together how far they had come from that single, unforgettable afternoon. Denise still keeps that same old, soft, worn photograph of 3-year-old Marcus in her wallet, right alongside a newer photograph of the two of them together now, side by side, taken on that very same emotional stage exactly 1 year after their reunion. I used to think that photograph in my wallet was all I would ever have of him, Denise says softly, whenever she tells the story now. Just one faded picture of a little boy I lost. But now, when I open my wallet, I see both pictures side by side, the boy I lost and the man I found. And every single time, without fail, it reminds me that no matter how long the wait feels, no matter how impossible it seems, love really does find its way home in the end. The story didn't stop rippling outward after that first year. It kept growing, quietly, in ways that surprised even Denise and Marcus themselves. About 18 months after the reunion, a local church back in Flint, Michigan, the same city where Denise had grown up scraping by with four younger siblings, invited her to come speak at a Sunday service about faith and patience. Denise almost turned it down, nervous about standing in front of a congregation that included people who had known her as a struggling teenager, decades earlier. People who might remember the arrest, the years she disappeared from town entirely. But her mother, now in her 70s, and still sharp as ever, convinced her to go. "Baby?" her mother said, holding both of Denise's hands, the way she used to when Denise was small. "You spent your whole life being ashamed of the hardest chapter of your story. It's time you let people see the whole book, not just that one page." Denise stood at that pulpit and told the entire congregation everything. The arrest, the 8 years, the letters that stopped coming back, the birthday cakes made for an empty chair. She watched grown men in the back pews wipe their eyes. She watched her own mother crying quietly in the front row, gripping the arm of the pew like it was the only thing holding her upright. When Denise finished speaking, an elderly woman near the front stood up, unprompted, and said, "Baby, I remember you as a little girl carrying your sisters on your hip. I always knew God had something big planned for you. I just didn't know it would take this long to arrive." The whole congregation applauded, and Denise cried the entire drive home that night, not from sadness, but from something she didn't quite have a word for yet. Maybe relief, maybe pride, maybe simply the feeling of finally being fully known by the people around her. Marcus, meanwhile, had his own quiet chapter unfolding. About 2 years after the reunion, he was promoted at his electrician job to a lead position, overseeing a small crew of his own. His supervisor, a gruff older man named Walt, who had been in the trade for 30 years, pulled him aside one afternoon, after a job site inspection, and said, "Coleman, I don't know what happened in your life before you walked through my door, but whatever it was, it built something solid in you. You show up. You don't quit, halfway through a job. That's rare these days." Marcus never told Walt the whole story, not directly, but he thought about that conversation often, especially on the hard days, and it reminded him that the years of uncertainty hadn't broken him. They had, in some strange way, built him into someone steadier. Marcus began dating a young woman named Tasha around that same time, someone he'd met through a mutual friend at a cookout. Tasha worked as a school teacher, patient and warm, in a way that reminded Marcus, he later admitted, a little bit of his mother. When he finally brought Tasha to meet Denise for the first time, over a Sunday dinner of smothered chicken and greens, Denise watched the two of them together all evening. The easy way Marcus laughed with her. The gentle way he reached over to refill her glass without being asked. And she thought to herself, quietly, that whatever pain the world had put this boy through, it had not stolen his capacity for tenderness. That, to Denise, felt like its own kind of miracle, separate from the reunion itself. 2 years and 4 months after the original taping, Marcus proposed to Tasha in Denise's own backyard. Under the same maple tree Denise used to sit beneath during the loneliest years of her search, back when she would come outside just to breathe fresh air and remind herself the world was still turning, even when it felt frozen in place. Denise stood at the kitchen window, watching the whole thing unfold, tears streaming down her face, thinking about how many birthdays she had spent alone under that very same tree, never imagining that one day it would become the backdrop for her son's happiest moment. At the wedding the following spring, Denise gave a short toast that she had rewritten a dozen times in the weeks leading up to the big day, terrified of breaking down before she could finish it. In the end, she kept it simple. "I missed 14 birthdays," she said, raising her glass with a trembling hand, looking directly at her son standing beside his new bride. 14 birthday cakes made for an empty chair. But I am not going to spend one more minute of today thinking about what I missed. Today, I only want to think about everything that's still ahead of us." To Marcus and Tasha, may your home always have room for more chairs, more cakes, and more love than either of you know what to do with. The room, full of family from both sides. Denise's siblings, Marcus's Georgia relatives who had once kept him from her, all seated together at the same tables, now having found their own complicated peace with one another over the preceding 2 years. Rose in applause, many of them crying just as hard as Denise was. The Georgia family, to their credit, had made real efforts at reconciliation in the years following the reunion. Marcus's aunt, the woman who had primarily raised him during those lost years, sat down privately with Denise about 6 months after the original taping and offered a long, tearful apology, explaining the fear and confusion that had driven so many of the decisions made back then, admitting that cutting off contact had felt, at the time, like protecting Marcus, though she could see now how much unnecessary pain it had. The microphone. No, please, please don't play with me like that. Please, Mr. Harvey, I'm asking you, please don't play with me. Steve's own eyes were glassy now, his composure clearly cracking at the edges.
Denise, look at me, he said. I would never, ever play with you about something like this. Not in a million years. Not about this.
Denise's coworkers around her were already crying openly, holding onto her arms and shoulders as if they were afraid she might collapse right out of her chair. The entire studio had gone completely still, an unnatural silence for a room usually filled with buzzers and laughter and applause. Marcus is 19 years old now, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. He was no longer bothering to hide. He's currently studying to become a licensed electrician. He works part-time at an auto repair shop to help pay for his training. And Denise, listen to me closely, because this is important. He never stopped looking for you either. Denise let out a sound that wasn't quite a word at all, something caught between a sob and a gasp, the sound of 14 years of silence finally cracking wide open all at once, right there in front of hundreds of strangers and millions of future viewers.
He wrote you letters too, Steve continued. Ones that never made it to you, because of circumstances beyond either of your control. He kept every single one of them, hoping that someday, somehow, some way,
he'd get the chance to hand them to you himself. Steve turned his body slightly toward the side curtain of the stage.
Denise, I'm going to need you to stand up now.
If you can. Denise could barely feel her own legs beneath her. Her coworkers helped her rise from the chair, one hand carefully placed under each arm, as though she might shatter if they let go too quickly, as if she were made of something far more fragile than flesh and bone. Marcus, Steve called out toward the curtain, his voice carrying across the entire studio. Come on out here, son. The curtain at the side of the stage parted slowly, and a tall young man stepped through it, wearing a plain gray hoodie and jeans, his hands visibly trembling at his sides, his eyes already wet with tears. He wasn't trying to hold back. He looked so much like the man captured in Denise's old, soft, faded photograph. The very same eyes, the same set of the jaw, everything grown up and matured now, but unmistakably, undeniably, her son. Denise's knees buckled beneath her the moment she saw him. She didn't run toward him. She couldn't. 14 years of accumulated grief had turned her legs to something like stone, rooted in place by the sheer weight of the moment. It was Marcus who ran to her instead, closing the distance between them in just a handful of long, urgent strides, wrapping his arms tightly around his mother for the very first time since he was 3 years old. Mama, he said, his voice breaking apart entirely on that single, simple word. Mama, I never stopped looking for you, not for one single day. Denise sobbed openly into his shoulder, gripping the fabric of the back of his hoodie with both fists, as though she were afraid the entire moment might vanish into thin air the second she loosened her grip. I wrote you every single week, she cried, her words tumbling out fast and broken between sobs. Every week, baby, for years, I never missed one. Not one.
I know, Marcus said, pulling back just far enough to look directly into her eyes. I have every letter you ever sent me, Mama. I kept them all in a shoebox under my bed my whole life. I used to read them over and over, whenever I missed you the most, even the ones I couldn't fully understand when I was little.
The entire studio was in tears at this point, audience members reaching for tissues, camera operators visibly wiping their own eyes between shots. Steve Harvey himself had to turn away from the pair for just a moment, wiping at his